here we are, Enthusiasm for Science, PLC number 2.
That's right, dose, and it's all about science in the classroom, i.e. how to incorporate food.
All right, so Elizabeth and I are here to make some connections between bugs and peanut brittle. Okay, yes, we might be eating bugs or
peanut brittle, hard to say.
All right, so our goal is to share this with you and to eventually teach you how to make a podcast and to have some fun doing it. Next slide.
All right, so we'll start with the bug aspect and cold weather and how they're related to peanut brittle in the end. All right, so when we think of animals making it through winter, our minds typically jump to things like squirrels and raccoons, birds, and other feathered or furry creatures that are outside in the winter. But what about crickets and beetles, spiders and flies, all the creepy crawlies that are out there? How do these animals survive the deep freeze without fur or feathers? All right, so we're going to be talking about the built-in antifreeze that different insects employ, like this Upas beetle right here. In actuality, it's not the cold that's the problem in terms of animals surviving through the winter. It's the ice that's deadly. Why, you might ask? It's because our bodies are composed mostly of water, actually about 78 to 80% water. The formation
I didn't know that. No.
Oh, well, not many people do unless you teach anatomy, huh, Dr. Lytle? Anyways, formation of ice crystals causes our cells to become dehydrated and shrink, and that damages our tissues. So then how do insects actually prevent this ice formation? Well, like birds, they can migrate south to warmer temperatures, but this doesn't really answer the not freezing part, so we'll ignore that for now. They could burrow or overwinter in ponds and lakes that don't freeze, but again, that doesn't really answer the how do they not have ice crystals that form. The real answer is this guy right here, biochemical resilience. Talking about antifreeze proteins that can attach to ice crystals to inhibit their growth in these insects' bodies. In addition to these antifreeze proteins, insects can also use complex sugars. An example would be xylomannin, which is employed by the Upas beetle that I showed you on the previous slide. And they can use these to suppress ice growth formation from even happening. Insects aren't the only ones out there, though, that can tolerate sub-zero temperatures. Antifreeze proteins have also been found in Antarctic fish, types of bacteria, fungus, as well as many types of frogs. So, granted, we haven't gotten to the peanut brittle connection yet, but we will. But in addition to peanut brittle, there are also a number of other applications for these antifreeze proteins and things that can make it interesting to learn about. Currently, there's a lot of research going on, especially at Ohio State University, looking into how to use these antifreeze proteins in various commercial applications. Big one that probably jumps to mind is agriculture, as you can see with these strawberries right here that have lots of ice being formed on them. A practical application would be how to integrate these antifreeze proteins into commercial crops so that we can prevent freezing and have a much longer growing season. In terms of medical applications, it would be looking at how to prevent freezing of tissues in terms of frostbite or in organ transplants or a number of other things where you have to actually keep the organ on ice before you can put it into a body. How do you incorporate maybe anti-freezing proteins into that process?
So I have a question for you. Does that mean that if you're dehydrated, you'd probably weather the cold a lot better? I have no idea, but it just all of a sudden occurred to me.
I don't know.
It's probably not that big of a difference.
Probably not that big of a difference. In fact, if you're already dehydrated to start, my guess would be, wouldn't you just keep getting more dehydrated?
Yeah, that could be.
So wouldn't you just be feeding into the cycle?
Yeah.
Would be my guess, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Anyways, last two applications that we have for antifreeze proteins are prevention of freezer burn. So if your meat looks like this right here with lots of ice crystals all over it, you know it's going to ruin the taste and the flavor. And so there's research right now going on to figure out how to prevent this situation using these antifreeze proteins found in insects and frogs and other sorts of animals. Last, believe it or not, if you're an easy breezy, beautiful cover girl out there, is looking at how to add these antifreeze proteins into makeup to prevent damage on your skin from cold weather temperatures. Whether that's a realistic application or important in any way, who knows? Hopefully OSU can sort that out for us. All right. Last but not least, on the insects in subarctic temperatures and how they resist freezing. Caveat to that is some actually don't resist freezing. Some insects actually do allow themselves to freeze. How, you ask? Why would they allow themselves to freeze? We already went over that fact that that can damage their tissues. Well, they can produce what we call cryoprotectant substances. Usually this is either glycerol, which you can see right here is the chemical formula for that, or they can produce alcohol, both of which can prevent ice crystal formation. Well, they don't prevent ice crystal formation, they slow the process of those crystals forming. This allows the animal to control the freezing speed and minimize damage to tissues due to the freezing and thawing. Essentially what happens is sugar is concentrated inside the cells so that the cells themselves do not freeze, and then the fluid on the outside, which does not have a lot of solutes, which is mostly water, freezes, but that prevents damage to the cells, which themselves don't freeze.
Can I ask you a question about that? You know, when we were little, when we make homemade popsicles, we would pour the Kool-Aid into the the ice cube trays. And we always noticed that the middle of the ice cube was the last to freeze, and that's where all the flavor and sugar was. Is that kind of like that concentrating of the sugar in the middle of the ice cube? Isn't that kind of like what these animals would be doing?
I don't know, you're the chemist. Why don't you talk to us about diffusion and maybe however that would play in terms of how molecules are moving around.
All right, that sounds like a good segue into what my topics were as well. So let me go into that. So when you have solutions, and we'll talk about water solutions since most of the living things that we have to deal with are aqueous solutions. So it turns out that a couple of properties of solutions that are important for us here, at least with this podcast, is that the temperature at which water freezes or water boils depends on whether the solution is concentrated or dilute. So the more concentrated the solution, the longer period of time or the greater range of temperatures where it'll stay liquid. So if water normally freezes at 0 and boils at 100 degrees, then at a more concentrated solution, the freezing point is going to be significantly lower the more concentrated the solution, and the boiling point will be higher the more concentrated the solution. So if you're talking about your animals that want to concentrate the sugars in that different part of their cell, then that's my guess, my hypothesis, right, as to why that happens. So Elizabeth's talk was more about the cold end, and when we make ice cream, we would have that same kind of concept where we have ice cream is really a sugar solution, and that sugar solution in ice cream is fairly concentrated, and so in order to freeze the ice cream, we've got to get it colder than 0. We've got to get below, and so that's why we put that rock salt around the outside of the ice cream in order to allow it to freeze. On the flip side of that, we have the boiling point of water is elevated if you have a concentrated sugar solution. That's precisely what happens with making peanut brittle. So if you make peanut brittle, basically you're using sugar and water, and of course we have changed the names to protect the innocent, so to speak. You've got water, sucrose. Anybody know what this is? Corn syrup, peanut butter, and vanilla. Okay?
Let's just throw a little bit more biology in there real quick though. What is C12H22O11 sucrose that makes it a what?
Disaccharide, is that
Well
right?
done. It's a dehydration reaction, so you lose 2 H's and
2 H's and 1 O. That's right. That's right. All right, so we're going to take this sugar and the water, and we're going to form a solution. And that solution will boil at a temperature higher than 100 degrees Celsius. Well, if you read through the procedure, and if you guys want to make some of your own, you can feel free to do that. I could get the recipe for you. But basically, you add a fair amount of sugar and not much water. And so that is why the solution is so concentrated. We can go through the details sometime, but not here. The point is to kind of just introduce you to the idea. So I worked up a couple questions of how we might approach this in chemistry, looking at how much water was used, how much sugar was used, converting it to moles, calculating the change in temperature, and then calculating the amount of water in the solution after you've boiled it off. So when you boil it off and you make your peanut brittle, there's 2 different times that you record the temperature. One is when it's boiling at 135 degrees Celsius, and the idea what that is in Fahrenheit. Do you remember what that was on a thermometer? It was like
250?
I think that could be right.
Fahrenheit?
250 Fahrenheit, something like that. 135.
I'm pretty sure it was
250, 260, yeah. And then the final temperature of the water was 150 degrees, which corresponds to about 300. Is that right, Fahrenheit?
That's correct.
300 Fahrenheit. So think about that. If the boiling point of water in Fahrenheit is 212, in Celsius 100, then you're getting it up there. It's a pretty concentrated solution. So kind of connecting this to some other aspects, not only do we have the involvement with ice cream making, but again in the winter we also have the freezing point depression. That consequences that we have to deal with is icy sidewalks. What do we put down on the sidewalks? The salts. And of course, you reach a point where there's a limit when it's really cold out, like it was earlier this week. Sometimes the salt doesn't work and you just need friction. You need sand. And the other concept is putting antifreeze both in your pipes if you are up north and you're not using your home, or in your car in the winter. We have a little something to share with you that kind of summarizes our work. So we'll just scroll through a few pictures, let you see, and
don't worry, we'll also let you taste. We made enough peanut brittle for everybody.
We had fun doing this, and honestly, the making of the podcast, Elizabeth, what would you say? Was it hard?
No, it's super simple, and we are just about ready to walk you guys through that process. In fact, it was pretty much as easy as pulling up the website, fitting the screen, and then us just talking at you guys for the last 15 minutes, and then we were done.
All right. Well, enjoy the peanut brittle.
And here comes directions on how to make your own podcast.
Bye.